So I'm going to go through the past, the immediate future, and what we can aspire to in the very long run. I'm going to talk an awful lot about assessment, but that doesn't mean that I believe that assessment should drive learning. Far from it. I think that assessment should be facilitative of good learning, and it should respond to what we want to achieve in the curriculum. I'm going to talk a lot about international comparisons. I'm very fortunate. I work in a non-teaching department of Cambridge University, so believe it or not, there are 2,500 people in Cambridge Assessment, and we work in 170 countries, providing examinations and assessment services, and increasingly advising governments on curriculum innovation and reform as well. That gives us kind of privileged access to forms of education and approaches to curriculum and assessment in many, many different settings. There are some researchers who say you can learn nothing from international comparisons because the cultural differences are so great from one country to another, from England to Shanghai, or Shanghai to Hong Kong, Shanghai to Finland. They're wrong. You can. So that's the group of people who say you can learn nothing. There are others who say that what you need to do is you need to really take approaches immediately from other systems. You can learn everything from those systems. They're wrong too. What we need to do is observe what's happening in other systems with an eye on the context, an eye on what they want to achieve. And very often they are kind of natural experiments. You can say, right, they wanted to achieve this, they did that, and this is what occurred. And actually observing that from the outside can be very, very helpful in helping us to reflect on our own system. So learning nothing, that's naive. Learning everything, that's naive. What you have to do is, in a very analytic way, look at what's occurring in other systems and use them to reflect on your own. And that's what I'm going to do this morning, pretty relentlessly. Obviously, very long opening session. I hope it's exciting enough, or alternatively, you had enough coffee to stay awake after a long journey. But some of the things I'm going to say are pretty challenging. Okay, let's just think about the past, the present, the immediate future, and the attainable ideal. I think we need to keep in mind what we could achieve in education, and we need to keep that in mind all the time. Because in a system, and it's inevitable in all systems, we see it around the world, endless change, which is not going to go away, structural reform, curriculum change in assessment, we have to keep our eye on what it is that we actually want to achieve. That sounds an incredibly simplistic statement. It's not, and I'll illustrate why it's important in just a moment. You may have heard repeatedly about the importance of lesson study. And there are good conferences on this. There's going to be a conference in Exeter towards the end of the year in September on the importance of lesson study. I'm going to talk quite a bit about lesson study in emphasising high-quality approaches to assessment and to curriculum. Is anybody here from any of the maths hubs? Anybody involved in any of the maths hubs? Have gone on any of the exchanges? No? Okay. So, that was great. I mean, maths hubs were set up, exchanges with Shanghai were put in place, and quite a lot of primary teachers and secondary teachers went to Shanghai, and Shanghai teachers came to this country and were in the schools of those who went to Shanghai. And it worked phenomenally well. A great aspect of the title of this conference, A Secret to Great Learning with Less, suddenly the primary schools in particular realized from the experience of being in Shanghai and talking to the Shanghai teachers who came into their own schools that they really should go much more slowly through demanding maths content, making sure that each child is constructing an effective understanding of the key concepts. And this kind of insight into how you should pace the curriculum really came from these big international comparisons. I'll refer to Stigler and Stevenson's work in just a moment. Lesson observation is really, really important. Lesson study is really, really important if you're primary or secondary. I was governor at a big sixth form college, a leading sixth form college in the south, and over over 15 years ago now, they implemented lesson observation. And not within subjects, but it included across subjects. And it led to a very slow, incremental, but very significant improvement in the quality of what they did. And that showed in the outcomes. Instead of saying, what outcomes do we need to achieve, they looked at the quality of the provision. And of course, then good exam results followed. I mean, the kids just knew more because the lessons were really good. And I'll explore what I mean by a good lesson in just a moment, because it's very linked to assessment. And lesson study is enshrined in places like Japan and Hong Kong and Shanghai. In Shanghai, it's fascinating. The very best lessons are extracted out of a school by the group of research-oriented teachers that meet in that school. They're put forward for regional competitions. The best 10 from those regional competitions go through into the next edition of the textbook, which is then available to all schools in Shanghai. That's quite interesting. So the textbook is not some kind of dead instrument. It's based on the very best practice, which, because the textbook is then disseminated to all schools, can be shared with all schools. In Japan, I mean, you've got to imagine this, it's quite frightening. Demonstration lessons are held. So a good lesson from a school, teachers then come and observe that very same lesson being delivered again. At its extreme, this can be done in a sports hall with 2,000 teachers watching a teacher teach a class of 45 students. And they run the lesson again. I mean, just imagine that. I mean, it's quite interesting. So they're profoundly interested in what makes a good lesson. And there's a fantastic paper, which is a bit neglected by Stigler and Stevenson, called How Asian Teachers Polish Each Lesson to Perfection. It vanished from the web for a while. It's back on again. It's a brilliant study, and I really would commend it to you. But think of the title, How Lessons Are Polished. I frequently talk to primary school teachers, and they say, oh, God, you know, I'm not going to do this again because it's so boring. No, they forget that this year's kids have never seen it. It may be boring to the teacher to do exactly that thing again, but it's not boring to that set of kids. The idea of polishing something around a particular idea is really, really fundamental to quality in many education systems around the world. Fortunately, we are doing it here too. Now, I'll give you one example. Robin Miller's done brilliant work on key concepts in science. He's at York, and he has identified a lovely activity that you can do with young children. It can be done in primary, but it's also important to do it in secondary because many kids do not understand conservation of mass. It's a really, really difficult idea. And if you don't understand conservation of mass, you believe in magic energy or magic mass, and something disappears or appears in systems. So the activity that he has identified as being really profoundly effective in getting kids to an understanding of it. It's just a set of digital scales on which you put two vessels. In one you have water, on the other you have sugar. And you put it in front of a group of kids and you ask them, what will happen to the weight when I put the sugar in the water? Okay. Now, it's just amazing what you get. It'll get lighter because the water holds the sugar up. It'll get lighter because the sugar disappears. It'll get heavier because you put the sugar in the water. Okay. Now this is very interesting because it's a very structured activity. You can do it time and time and time again. You know exactly how to do it. And it unpacks deep misconceptions amongst children. And you're asking them questions. And throughout this presentation, I will talk about questions. And that's very much the link to Frog and what Frog's doing. Lucy Crehan has just gone around, I mean, she's a great woman. She's a young teacher. She said, right, I'll take a couple of years off and I'll just teach in as many countries as I can. So she phoned up schools in Finland and said, can I come and teach in your school? So she taught in Finland, Canada, Shanghai, Singapore. And she's about to produce a book called Cleverlands, and I'm going to read some of it out today. Got fantastic insights into the way in which there are different models of ability, different processes of assessment, different understandings of curriculum and progression in these different countries. And I'm going to give you access to all those different dimensions as I talk through the past, present, immediate future, and attainable ideal. And if you just put in a word search in her text, which is about 152 pages, questions, you just get up hundreds of hits. In other words, when she looked at what was going on in these different countries in classrooms, by virtue of actually being in the classrooms, teaching, just as I go into classrooms all around the world and do observations of what's going on, the idea of what questions you ask of kids is just fundamental to understanding the quality of the pedagogy. So this morning, I'm going to talk about assessment in respect of we need loads more of it, not less. But it should be oriented to the kind of questions which we need to put to kids to unlock their understanding. What happens when you put the sugar in the water? Dylan William has a great example which he uses in lectures relentlessly, so it's good, so I have stolen it. And it's this. And it illustrates the problem with levels and with the national curriculum. Because what we had in the past, in the recent past, was the idea that you should move quickly through the curriculum. If you haven't got pace in your curriculum, and remember the Ofsted inspections that said there's not enough pace in your lesson. Okay. That was quite problematic. It was true that many schools were not really engaging with the appropriate progression of their children. And some children were bored and disengaged, and children were not making enough progress. But relentless pace is actually highly problematic. And if you haven't got enough time to ask, in the space in your class, in your class, to ask penetrating questions and to wait for the answers, then you will not reveal the misconceptions that children have, which result in poor performance and confusion and slows down the learning in the child's mind considerably. So the question is this. He was working with a group of kids in chemistry, and it's in second year of secondary school, and they were working on the chemical composition of water. Now, if you're anxious about targets and levels, you want to spot anything which will enable you to get the tick in the box that somebody's moved from one sub-level to another sub-level, because that's good teaching. That enables the head teacher to sit in their office and look at the data emerging on the screen, which says, yes, everything's fine in every classroom, without them having to leave their office. So relentless pace, very problematic. So Dylan's with this child and says, you've been doing the chemical composition of water. What's the chemical composition of water? And the child says H2O. Great. Tick in the box. Move on. No. What is that? Explain that, says Dylan. And the child said, well, it's 2 bits of hydrogen, 1 bit of oxygen, held together by forces spinning around each other. Great. Tick in the books. Move on. Great. We've managed to move the child on. We can get a tick in the box in terms of the sublevels. Okay, says Dylan to the child. What's between the hydrogen and the oxygen? And the child says, water. So unless you've got time to ask penetrating questions, you do not understand the concepts that a child is building up. That's secondary. Now this came home to me only recently with my own child. I was standing in the wood at the back of our village, talking to our village outside Cambridge, chock full of preeminent scientists, and one of them owns the wood, and we were chopping down these 20-metre trees, and we were, as you do, talking about plate tectonics. So my 10-year-old was there, and he was talking very knowledgeably about plate tectonics. Great. And then he said, but there won't be an earthquake in San Francisco soon, because it's unlikely for there to be a meteorite strike. What? And we've been talking about the fact that it was a bad idea to build houses on the San Andreas Fault. So we both turned around to Alex and said, what? And he said, well, there's not going to be a meteorite strike. Now, he could talk incredibly effectively and accurately about plate tectonics, tick in the box, move on. But he thought that earthquakes were triggered by meteorite strikes. He knew that the tectonic plates store up energy, but his idea of the event which releases it was a meteorite strike. You see, relentless pace forces you as a teacher just to spot those things that you can put ticks in boxes and move on, because it's so concerned about coverage. And the Shanghai Exchange taught one school outside Cambridge, Bourne Academy, very, very good school, exceptionally good actually, compared with the very poor performance we often see throughout the eastern region. They said, right, what we've done is really slowed down, moving through the fundamental concepts in mathematics in our school. We're worried about whether we're going to cover everything that we need to by the end of Key Stage 2, but my goodness, it is improving the maths attainment of all of our children and their underlying maths understanding. And so the second issue is this, differentiation. In the past, we pursued the wrong model of differentiation. I'm very clear about this. We had the government in the late 90s talking about the importance of individualised learning. And individualised learning is important because you have to probe a child's understandings, each individual child, to make sure that misconceptions are not building up, to understand how each child is constructing the meaning of conservation of mass or metaphor or tectonic plate. So in that sense, individualised learning is very important. But, and it's a big but, the sense of individualised learning that we had was every child should have their own curriculum. Each child at their own rate and pace, massively differentiated lessons, not just one lesson preparation sheet, but dozens, because we needed to respond to each and every individual child with a different approach to the curriculum content. I mean, that's a nightmare in terms of excessive load. That's not what happens in these other high-performing systems. So listen to this, a couple of things. We've been banging on about textbooks in Cambridge recently, and we've produced something called the Cambridge Approach to High-Quality Resources. It's on the website now. We launched it a few weeks ago, and it's being used for curriculum reform in many different national settings. Finland. You've all heard about Finland and how wonderful life is as a teacher in Finland. It's nirvana. There's no national testing, there's no national inspection, huge amounts of professional autonomy, teachers are widely respected. It's just a wonderful place to be. So of course, they must be paid more than anywhere else. Actually, they're paid round about the OECD average. They can't use things like textbooks, surely, because they do really well and they really care for the children. Yeah, but again, go to Finland, ask the right questions, you get a completely different view. In Finnish schools, and this is a quote from a preeminent educator in Finland, the textbook is the main tool. Experienced and skillful teachers have come together with a publisher to create an interesting, enjoyable and motivating textbook that's based on the current curriculum. Nowadays, teachers have so many other things to do than planning the lessons, that I would say all the teachers depend on the materials a lot. I think this system is really typical for Finland and concerns the whole country. Of course, there are some exceptions, teachers who insist doing things on their own, and maybe not even using textbooks. But that's really rare. Who has the time? Now, that's really does challenge the perceptions of the Finnish education system. They use textbooks a lot, because they're really well designed. They've got really good questions within the chapters that you can ask to children to probe their understanding. They've got really good lessons and activities because they've been pulled out of practice by the publishers working with the teachers, reducing the workload. Of course, we've also seen, alongside levels, targets. And we've seen many local authorities fixated on the CD boundary at GCSE. And we know that leads to a neglect of the most able and the least able, and a focus on those just on the threshold. And rightly, the government has introduced new accountability measures which ensure that schools have a broader set of concerns than merely those on the threshold. But levels did exactly the same. That was GCSE, but levels did exactly the same. How many schools I've been into in primary focused on those kids that would, if those kids didn't do well on the day, that would be a disaster for the school because they're on the threshold around level 4. So all of these ideas, relentless pace, differentiation of a particular kind, targets and levels, There were some good things to it. It caused everybody to be concerned about standards. It enabled people to be concerned about individual children. So there were some good things, but those were the bad things, and boy, are they significant. Unmanageable pedagogic approaches, excessive load, unintended washback from the thresholds and the targets and the accountability measures, and worst of all, gaps and insecure learning. So I usually put up a slide which talks about why we got rid of levels, but I'll just say it very briefly. Levels didn't make sense. It didn't make sense to describe a child using a very summary label, because you need to know what they think about tectonic plates. You need to know what they think about the chemical composition of water. And you don't get that if you're constantly trying to decide whether this child is 4C. And the problem was that there were 3 different models of getting that label, and it's a label, level 4, out of what a child was doing. You could get it from a national test, so a score on a national test, even though 2 different children could be level 4, therefore the same, but having answered entirely different profile of questions on that test. The second understanding of level came from APP, best fit, and that's very different from getting a score on a national test. But it's the same label, level 4. And in assessment, that's bad, because people infer different things from the same label for the wrong reasons. And then thirdly, it was threshold. Thank God this kid's in level 4, otherwise we'd be in special measures. The one kid that luckily makes sure our data are okay. Just being in level 4 is not the same as mastering level 4 content. I mean, that would be bad enough, but there was more, of course. 2 things I'll emphasise, even though the list is much longer. One is labelling. The whole idea behind Paul Black and Dylan Williams' original introduction of levels was to avoid children labelling themselves. Grade D, grade D, grade D, all the way through education, or 40%, 40%, 40%. Each child making progress, they say, yes, this year I have gone from level 3 to level 4. Brilliant. But kids were doing it too. All my friends are this level and I'm this level. And worse, children were saying, that's not for me, that content. And again, a carefully selected anecdote about my own child. My daughter went to secondary school. She brought some homework back. It was really good homework in biology, on IVF. There were 5 questions, and I sat down with her, and she said, oh, yeah, it's just the first 2, Dad. Well, no, hang on, Erin, because the last 3 questions are really interesting. No. They're level 6 questions. They're not for me. Okay, because I'm working towards level 5. That's what she said. Okay. Now, she could answer the questions. It was a devil's own work to get her to even confront them. And so you can see how adverse this labelling is. I'll come on to the idea of exposure in a moment. And also, perhaps worst of all, beyond the problems of low-quality assessment and giving this label on different bases to the same child, was the breakdown in trust between primary and secondary, where so many children came up to secondary with a particular label in terms of levels, but unable to do the things, such as we read widely, which are necessary for benefiting from the secondary curriculum. So it led to a real breakdown in trust between secondary and primary schools. So that's all pretty significant stuff. Now, moving quickly, we have shifted in the national curriculum to fewer things in greater depth using international comparisons. I mean, there are more words in the national curriculum now than there were in the past, but there are fewer key concepts, fewer key fundamental operations, less core knowledge. It's really important. I mean, it's described in more detail, but there are fewer things in greater depth. There's been more international benchmarking over the last 3 or 4 years of standards in all assessment, through primary and into secondary, GCSEs and A-levels. Now, this doesn't go down well, but we are not the most assessed system in the world. And I've done a blog on this on the Cambridge Assessment website. Who is the most assessed system in the world? Probably America. Lots and lots of grade tests, lots of standardized tests. But boy, Finland does really well on testing too. Go into any Finnish classroom and you will find an extraordinary number of tests going on. The question is why and where do they come from? Often they come from, wait for it, teacher associations. Teacher associations in Finland are involved in writing tests, which are used in the classroom. This is why I argue for more assessment of a different kind. We think we're the most assessed system in the world because the few assessments that we do have weigh so heavily upon us because of the accountability arrangements. But it doesn't mean that we're the most assessed system in the world. Far from it. I don't think we assess enough. A Finnish teacher will complain about the amount of assessment that they feel they have to do, and they think they have to do it for a very good reason. They do not want kids to fall behind. They always want to identify the child who has misunderstood something so that they can then have special support to bring them back up to the level of the group so the whole group can move forward. That's really good. Finnish teachers complain about the amount of work that's involved in that, but it's a different model of ability, it's a different model of progression, and it's proved to be very effective in the Finnish system. What I argue in England is because we are so conflicted about assessment and don't like it, the purpose of each assessment really needs to be made clear. I think we need a national assessment framework which makes clear what the phonics check is for. Phonics check, brilliant. It's really important to know whether kids can read or not when they arrive at school or shortly after they're in school. It's a really good idea. Bad idea, giving it a cut score, because then mysteriously there are a very odd number of kids in our system that can actually score 33 on it, I assure you. It's very strange. So you want a nice distribution, but when you look at the national results of the phonics check, there's a huge spike just after 32. That's bad. So the purpose of each assessment needs to be made clear. A really good illustration of that is Mick Walker, who's in the audience. When he and I were at QCA before I went to Cambridge, we looked at the teachers' reactions to the optional tests and the national tests at Key Stage 2. Key Stage 2 tests, dreadful. Bad educationally, said teachers. Really bad assessment. Don't accurately reflect what my kids do. Don't like them at all. Horrible things. Optional tests, really good. Very good educationally. Work in terms of measurement, and actually do tell me what I want to know. Yeah, trouble is, optional tests are all Key Stage 2 tests. So what's going on? That is not a criticism of teachers. It's a really important insight into a test is good when you're using it for the right purpose, at the right time, giving you information that you can use to feed back into learning. And ideas really, really count. And I've already illustrated that in terms of Finland. Teachers use the tests for a particular idea to make sure that no child falls so far behind that they cannot be supported and brought back so that the whole group can move forward together, all discussing key ideas. And around the world we find remarkable differences in terms of models of ability, progression and equity. Now how about this? Stigler and Stevenson gave Canadian kids and Japanese kids an impossible maths problem. Now in Canada, kids are told, okay, you're good at maths, you are good at maths. You know, you have a lot of ability in maths as a child. And it's conceptualized in terms of ability and the brightness of the child. You're not good at maths, but we'll give you these activities and it'll be okay for you. This is a kind of language. In Asian settings, it is all about how much effort you put in. The Confucian model is every child capable of anything, depending on how much effort they put into it, and the way in which it's presented to them. Now, this idea differentiates what we do from what is done in many other settings. And by the way, Finland is a little bit of Asia in Europe, because they have the same idea. All children capable of anything, depending on how it's presented to them and the effort they put into learning it. Lo and behold, with this impossible maths problem, the Canadian kids gave up after a very short period of time, often measured in minutes. Stigler and Stevenson had to tell the Asian kids to stop working on it weeks later. They just took it away and carried on working on it in groups, after school and at home with their parents. And they even went on trying to solve it after they'd been told that it was impossible. Now, the model there is that I'm not bad at mathematics. If I put more effort in as a kid, I can understand it in the same way in which the people who get it very quickly do. Now, that's a really important assumption in primary, and I believe it continues to be a very important assumption in secondary. That model of ability, the assumptions about children, drive the nature of the curriculum and the forms of the questions in these other systems. So we've heard about textbooks and, digital systems like Frog. One of the most important things is, what are the questions like? What are the questions in the material? So I'll come on to this, and this is two different systems of assessment. So the next slide is two models of assessment, but this is what we've got at the moment, and we are not the most assessed system in the world. We've got a year-by-year statement in primary, we've got statutory tests at Key Stage 1, we've got the phonics screening check, the multiplication tables test, statutory tests at Key Stage 2 report against prior attainment. Of course, the baseline scheme rejected, but probably coming our way soon, another form of baseline. Not a bad thing if it's a good measure. Potential retesting in Key Stage 3 if threshold levels are not attained in Key Stage 2. That fundamentally changes Key Stage 2 testing, because Key Stage 2 testing at the moment is really about schools, not kids. That's where the consequences lie. But this makes it important for individual kids. And we need to recognise that there's a fundamental change. Non-modular GCSE, non-modular A-level, and then vocational qualifications. That's our assessment system. And in arguing for more assessment, am I saying there should be loads more tests in there? No. What I'm saying is there should be loads more testing of the right kind, which constantly permeates our curriculum approaches. In the immediate future, I want to shift to new models of attainment and progression. Read Stigler and Stevenson stuff about models of ability. Read about Finland and the assumptions they make about kids, these ideas. Read Lucy Crehan's book when it comes out, Cleverlands, because it is fascinating. The assumptions we make about children determine how we structure the curriculum, whether we set and stream, how rapidly we move through material, how we present things to the most able, who are always anxious to move on, but stretch them horizontally so they're still doing the same stuff, so that the other kids in the group can still talk to them. Went into a primary school, they said, we don't set and stream in mathematics. Brilliant, okay. Talked to a kid, oh yeah, I'm on the blue table, I'm not very good at maths. They're on the red table, they're really good at maths, and we don't talk to them much, not even in the playground. But the head, we don't set and stream in mathematics. Now, the important thing about that is that we don't talk to them very much, means that the insights that the most able in mathematics are gaining are not accessible to those who are struggling with the ideas. That's not what happens in Shanghai. What we need is granular analytic assessment, not this kid has moved a sub-level, but what is going on in a child's mind? What have they done successfully or unsuccessfully? And I'll look at the level of that granularity in a second. And we have forgotten, I'm afraid, it sounds so trite, but we have forgotten that the national curriculum is about all children having access to all of the national curriculum, not just getting a kid to a particular level in your phase of education, but giving them access to all of the ideas in the national curriculum. Now, I know, of course, with academy status, the national curriculum is not an instrument which is legally applied to all institutions, but the national curriculum is really good at the moment. It's been internationally benchmarked, it's been taken back to the good stuff that was there in '99, and it's when people in Silicon Valley recently looked at the computing science national curriculum, they said this is absolutely world-beating stuff. I mean, the national curriculum is chock full of really well-researched content at the moment. And we want all kids to have access to all of it, not some of it. So, okay, questions and systems. So, this idea of, what questions do we ask? So this is two schools, a tiny school, or relatively small school, a primary school. This is the top school is Dame Alison Peacock's Wroxham School, Potters Bar, just outside the M25. The bottom school is Sir Andrew Carter's South Farnham Primary School. Very, very big, much more like a secondary. Huge school. In the first one, there's a common agreement on a learning model, and they have they've discussed differentiation, they've discussed mastery, they've discussed ability, and it's, again, like a little bit of South Korea or Hong Kong in Potter's Bar. They believe in every child, and every child being able to understand anything depending on the effort they put into learning it and the way it's presented to them. A granular focus on learning. No discussion of levels other than meeting statutory reporting. They want to know what a kid is learning. And so they do a lot of granular analysis of each learning objective. Targeted support to learners who require it. In Finland, every child at every stage of their education will have had special support. If you're off for 2 days for illness or away because in the north you have to tend your family's herd, when you come back to the school, you will be given special support to bring you up to the level of the group so you don't fall behind. It's not stigmatised. High levels of qualification and competence in the TAs in that school, and that's really important. So if kids are not corralled because of poor behaviour with TAs who are not engaged with the cognitive demand of the content, and that's really important. So constantly making sure all kids are up at a level which enables the whole group to discuss the ideas. Pre-planning in the South Farnham school, that's a small school, and they all get together and discuss these ideas. In South Farnham, a really big school, pre-planning of learning programme on a termly and annual basis. Now this is really quite scary, and I'll talk about another scary school in a moment. There is a lesson plan for every lesson, and it's in a central folder in the curriculum head's office for every subject. Okay, now that's really, really interesting. So each lesson is described. It doesn't take much time to do it, and each lesson is always evaluated every time it's given. On every sheet, the teacher says what went well and what went badly, and it's adjusted. And there's reuse and refinement of the model activities, lesson observation. So it's just like Shanghai in terms of the textbooks. And if the teacher's off, the supply teacher knows what to do. And if there's a new teacher, they know what is going on in the school in terms of the curriculum and the learning progression. But they're involved, of course, in determining what is going well and what's going badly and modifying the stuff. Constant progress monitoring on a day-to-day basis. An immediate allocation of high-quality additional support. So if a kid is struggling, they go into a focus group, and they can be in that focus group for a few hours, a few days, or indeed even months, but always with the intention of getting them back to a level where they can join the main group. Use of incredibly high-quality resources, textbooks, and other digital resources throughout the school. Both have an agreed marking policy, the first because the kids and the teachers have been involved in deriving it, the second because it is a formal part of this very structured approach. Lots of assessment in both schools. Michaela Community School in North London, Catherine Burblesing's school, fascinating in terms of the density of assessment. All kids do tests in every subject every night at home. They take home a sheaf of quizzes, and the kids love them. And they're marked by the TA in the back of the classroom the next day, and the feedback given very quickly to the teacher so that they can identify any children who are falling behind and in need of special support. So quickly finishing now. Immediate future, and then I'll go on to the attainable ideal, and I'll finish at past. Construct focus. I mean, Dylan was talking about the chemical composition of water. So you want to know what it is that you're trying to get the kid to understand. Robin Miller was talking about conservation of mass, a really difficult idea. So he knew what he wanted the kids to actually achieve. And the questioning is oriented in respect of the key construct. By construct, we mean, what is a test really getting at? It could be something to do with science, it could be something to do with maths, it could be to do with reading. So constructs can vary enormously. But what is it trying to get at? This idea of construct is quite important. And the new national curriculum is great because it's chock full of really well-described constructs, the properties of the different states of matter. So you can immediately start thinking about what the questions should be on that. And the great thing about systems like Frog is that they make the construct very clear and then align materials and questions in respect of those. Changes of state in terms of the particle model. So all of the learning is focused on these key constructs, knowing what it is that you're trying to achieve. And the stuff in South Farnham, these lesson plans are often seemingly extremely modest because they're focusing on one bit of one construct or just on one construct. I mean, it's fewer things in greater depth, but with incredible focus. But it's not boring because you can make, believe it or not, you can make conservation of mass very exciting. Okay, so questions. Stigler and Stevenson's work, again, a great deal of time is spent in these other countries talking, between teachers talking in amongst themselves in their preparation time about questions which can be put to the class. Which questions work best to keep a whole class going for a long time? Questions which keep the class going for a long time. A bad one, and avoiding bad ones which produce little more than a simple answer. So this form of questioning is really important. And Lucy said the most obvious difference between maths lessons in England and lessons in Shanghai is the amount of time spent in whole class teaching. In Shanghai, loads of time spent in whole class teaching. So it must be really boring and traditional, apart from it isn't, when you actually observe it and see what's going on genuinely. This includes carefully planned lecturing, carefully planned lessons which work. And I went back to one thing, which they do in mathematics, and the person said, oh yes, Rong Fang, 5th century. The reason they've been using it for thousands of years is it just works, okay, as an activity for getting kids to understand mathematics. And again, another one was a question which can be traced back to 1601. So they use things because they work, and they use them in a seeming lecturing way because they're engaging activities which work, like the scales. This includes carefully planned lecturing, but it isn't all one-sided. Teachers actually ask questions, and they ask a huge number of questions. On average, wait for it, 50 to 120 questions per lesson of the kids. And making it highly interactive. Some of these questions are deliberately very easy, so that the teachers start where the children are and build up their explanations and questions, gradually moving on to more difficult mathematical concepts. And this idea of what the questions should be, that's what assessment is. It's asking questions. That's what a GCSE does. It asks questions. Then we analyse the results and give people a grade. So to finish, I want to leave you with these ideas: exposure, practice, and production. And that's the immediate future. And then I'll rattle through the ideal very quickly. By exposure, I mean there's a big problem with our national curriculum, and we couldn't, for understandable reasons, do anything about it in the revision for 2014, in the 2010 review. Of course, conservation of mass is in Key Stage 3, so that's when you teach it. No, it's in the national curriculum in Key Stage 3 because that's when kids need to demonstrate a complete understanding of it. You need to expose kids to the idea of conservation of mass when they're much, much younger and expose it to them all the way through. I mean, I take kids out at night and say, isn't it lovely to look at the stars? These kids are 4 and 5, and they say, whoa. I say, look, there's Orion's belt. They go, whoa. And I said, you know about gravity, don't you? And they say, yes, that holds us down on the planet. I said, okay, so isn't it great? Just think about it, to be held by the planet and look down at the stars. And they go, ah! Because suddenly they've got a completely different mental model of what's going on. And that's with very, very, very young children. Now, gravity isn't in the national curriculum for 4 and 5-year-olds. So the idea of exposing kids to ideas in a learning progression and then getting them to demonstrate mastery of it at the point at which it's listed in the national curriculum is a really important curriculum insight. The other two ideas, practice and production. So I did lesson observation in in the Wroxham school, and I said to Alison, "Blimey, your kids produce a lot." She said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, production, very, very important in assessment. Unless you get kids to produce a lot, you don't know what they're thinking. Unless you get kids to produce a lot, they won't know what they're thinking either." And look at the thickness of the workbooks in Wroxham, in that primary school. And I digitised 3 of them, and the kids just produce loads more than in many other schools. And they discuss it. Look, they're discussing it as they produce it. And they have an all-ability model, every child capable of anything, and they'll master it in terms of the effort and way it's presented to them. And this idea of production is really important. And it makes the thinking of the child an object of study for them, because they've written it down, and they can look at what they think and what they've done. Testing, questions, getting kids to produce things. It reveals pupils' thinking to teachers so they can then do something about it in terms of the next bit of learning. And there's a brilliant book. I mean, it's just absolutely stunning. And in many ways, it completely overturns what Gordon thought in the past. But it's Gordon Stobart, the expert learner. And he just says he's looked at the history of David Beckham. He's looked at the history of savants and musical geniuses. And he's looked at those that are competent in a whole range of fields. And practice is just fundamental. So we talk about practice in football. Practice in maths, that's going to be dull and boring, isn't it? But actually, practice in every subject, in respect of every concept, every construct, is absolutely vital. It's a brilliant book. Some of the textbooks are working, so they have pre-assessment at the beginning of each chapter. That's really important, like in Hong Kong. So we know where kids are before they start. They've got really good exercises that produce things so that the kids can see how well they're doing, and the teacher. And it's granular. No levels, not a level in sight. Singapore doesn't use levels, neither Hong Kong nor Finland, and it's not that they were missing a trick. They do something different. They do granular assessment. With linked and the latest stuff out of Cambridge University Press, the Key Stage 4 textbooks are brilliant because they're based on these international criteria that we developed with linked online resources. And those are the principles in Cambridge approach, again, available online. What's really interesting, we're making old exam questions available on the web, and it confounds everything that you might think. Lisa Jardine Wright and Mark Warner, brilliant physicists at the Cavendish Laboratory, I mean, they're leading physicists, have raided our archive of examination questions and noticed that the questions have got easier over the last 30 years. Now, they've made the hard questions available online, and even the Daily Mail has commended this in the last week. The kids and the teachers want these old, hard physics questions because they're good. They probe understanding. And we moved from in a very short period of time, a few months, to having 10,000 hits a day on these questions by pupils and teachers. There's a real demand for these hard questions. None of this, standards are slipping nonsense. This is teachers and pupils themselves wanting hard, probing questions in the learning. So what is the attainable model, the attainable ideal? I think we need a consensus about the purpose of all of our assessments. The phonics check does not have the same purpose as the multiplication table test. Those don't have the same purpose as the Key Stage 2 test. The Key Stage 2 test does not have the same purpose as a GCSE. We're all confused about the purpose of these assessments. We need to be much clearer. We need balanced accountability measures, and I do commend what this government has done in terms of introducing more sophisticated accountability measures, and it will have better washback effect into schools, I believe. But let's forget that we still have a problem. The Key Stage 3 science tests were removed. Science was removed from primary testing, and our science attainment is going down. We need far more assessment, not less. So none of this with the most assessed assessment in the world. We need far more assessment of the right kind. Rich question and answer and discourse in the classroom of the kind that I've described. We need granular analytic assessment. Summarising, level 4 was just a summary. And for what purpose? And what did it tell us? It told us things that were very misleading about what kids could and could not do. Summarising only at the right time and when strictly necessary. Feedback from that assessment, which stimulates thought about attainment and higher engagement, thought about attainment amongst the kids themselves and teachers. We want learning and assessment in a balanced relationship. Controversially, we need high rates of practice, much more practice than we have now in all subjects. Exercises, tests, that's what they do in Finland, that's what they do in Shanghai, that's what they do in Singapore. And production, doing things, actually getting it down. Why do we need things like a multiplication test? Because actually, there's loads of stuff which kids should memorize, because once they've memorized it, it's no longer in working memory. It's actually held in a different part of the brain. And Helena Badsy's work is fascinating. If you memorize stuff, it frees up your working memory for more demanding stuff that you can immediately focus upon. And that's really important. Kids who don't memorize the stuff through practice and production struggle when it comes to trying to do higher order thinking, because they don't know the background stuff which they need to bring to bear on this problem automatically. This is really, really important. And if we can do all of that, we will achieve something remarkable, which is high equity, high attainment, and high enjoyment. Because that's what we find around the world. Many of these high attaining systems, which have also emphasized equity, all children capable of anything, depending on how it's presented to them and the effort they put into it, there's not only better equity in the society, there's not only higher overall attainment, the kids just enjoy schooling far more and are committed to it. So there we go. It is, I think, genuinely the secret to great learning with less, a focus on fewer things in greater depth with granular assessment and much more assessment of the right kind. Thank you very much indeed.